I'd just like to introduce our guest presenter, Dr. Michael Doyle from the Centre for Research Excellence in Indigenous Health and Alcohol at the University of Sydney. Thanks for joining us here today, Michael.
Thank you.
So Michael is a Bardi man from the Kimberley region of Western Australia and a research fellow in the discipline of addiction medicine at Sydney University. His research focuses on AOD treatment for men involved in the criminal justice system. Michael has worked towards the improvement of Aboriginal health throughout his career, which began as an Aboriginal health worker in his home community of Jarrington in Western Australia. He moved into the research field in 2008, first working at the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin University, and then the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Michael's first qualification was an advanced certificate in Aboriginal health work. He also has a graduate diploma of Indigenous health promotion and was the first Aboriginal person to graduate with a Master of Public Health from the University of Western Australia. Michael has also just recently completed his PhD and is now officially Dr. Michael Doyle, so we'd like to extend a huge congratulations to him as well. So in this webinar today, Michael will present his PhD research, which involved a systemic literature review, an analysis of alcohol and other drug use patterns of people entering prison in New South Wales, and also interviewing 31 men in prison about their AOD treatment experiences. So we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, so we'd ask that you hold any questions you might have until the end. I'd just also like to mention that we are recording this webinar today as well. So we're now going to switch over to Michael in Sydney. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Millie. Yeah, I didn't realise I'd written such a big bio until you read it all out. So thanks. But welcome, everybody. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet here in Sydney. It's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, but also recognise all the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners around the country in the different locations that you may be joining us from. My research for the PhD is alcohol and other drug treatment in prison. So I've just been awarded the PhD the other week, and I think that was maybe the first time, Millie, I've ever heard anybody use that title. So that was kind of cool for me, I guess. So I just want to mention my supervisors, Tony Butler, Jill Guthrie, Anthony Shakeshaft, and Megan Williams, who it was a great supervision team, and yeah. Okay. So, oh, hang on, that's not quite how I expected. So a little bit about me. You've heard that through that bio, and so, but this is just to give you an idea. There's my home community up in the Kimberley region up there. The photo in the middle at the top is a photo from many years ago of my grandfather and his contemporaries. I also at this point acknowledge that different Aboriginal people have different experiences of the colonisation or invasion process, and that we've sort of all affected in one way or another, and there's a bit of crossover, but we're also there are some ways in which we're affected differently. So, alcohol over drug treatment research in the prison population. Well, why study in this area? Well, there's high prevalence of risky alcohol and other drug use by men entering prison. And this is well documented, not just in Australia, but also around the world. And we're looking at about 75% of people in prison who have that history of alcohol and other drug use. Particular focus on Aboriginal people because we're imprisoned at about 15 times the rate of other Australians. I think that might have actually increased slightly recently, but it's a tremendously high rate, and I'll be speaking a bit about the imprisonment shortly. Benefit and significance. So more effective AOD treatment could lead to improved health. So hopefully if people sort of in prison, if they can address their alcohol and drug use issues in a better way, then you'd hope there'd be flow-through effects, and of course reduce the likelihood of return to prison. Within the community, the Aboriginal community, people are really concerned about this. So every single family is, in one way or another, affected by somebody having been in prison or somebody currently in prison. So this is a really major issue. And just finally, the Uluru Statement, just to draw your attention to that even that national statement was made, and it said that we are not innately criminal, and it spoke about the over-imprisonment of Aboriginal people. So this is the rate per 100,000 population, and you can see a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017 inclusive, and this sort of steady upward trend. You could take, and this is the blue line on the top I'm speaking about, so you could take that back to the Royal Commission, which was released, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991, and there was a dip after that for a year or two. Then it went back up, and it's never sort of looked back ever since. So I guess we've got to wonder how much longer we can continue this upward trajectory of Aboriginal imprisonment. The other story that's happening there is the green line along the bottom, and there has been an increase in non-Aboriginal imprisonment, but it's not been anything like the increase in Aboriginal people. And that imprisonment rate has remained fairly stagnant over that same period of time of increasing Aboriginal imprisonment. So my work is predominantly with men, or exclusively with men, really. I would not be interviewing an Aboriginal woman about her drug and alcohol use. It's just sort of culturally, it's not the done thing. But I also think that there's also some element of getting better information if you're male. But sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. But so you see there the rate of imprisonment per 100,000, and you can see each of the jurisdictions. So this is not a sort of a even distribution, and there's a really major issue in Western Australia. As you can see, all over the country, the imprisonment rate is tremendously high. But you see there that the national rate's in the middle. Now, what accounts for this? I don't honestly believe it's because Aboriginal people in different parts of the country are more likely to commit offences. It's possibly more likely to do with other factors, such as the way in which justice is administrated, or perhaps sentencing practices, but I don't know that for sure, but that would be my assumption. So it also shows that there could be a possibility, even if we got WA back to like New South Wales imprisonment levels, that would be a significant improvement. Prevalence of hazardous drinking using the audit risk level. So alcohol use disorders identification test, and this is World Health Organization tool with 10 questions that helps identify if there is an alcohol issue for the person who fills that out. Now, these stats are from the 2015 Patient Health Survey of the Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network. And the blue bars are the Aboriginal men and Aboriginal women, and then you see non-Aboriginal men and non-Aboriginal women. And there's this concentration of risky drinking in the high category, which is 20 plus. And the audit recommends that further treatment should be sought to address the possibility of alcohol dependence. And there's quite a different distribution there, as you can see. Rise in hazardous alcohol use. Over that period, we've seen, so there's been 3 health surveys, and so since 2001, you can see this upward trajectory of a concentration of people in the higher level, higher risk of drinking. Now, used illicit or licit drugs at least once ever. So this is just if you've ever had these drugs. And so cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug in Australia, and you can see that clearly there. But there's been a lot of other drug use, and as you can see, people have also been on methadone within this particular study. And this was daily use of drugs, of illicit drugs before prison. And you can see there the Aboriginal use of cannabis is over 60%, and that's very consistent with what we know in the community as well, where we do see higher rates of cannabis use within the Aboriginal community. You can see methamphetamine use is higher among Aboriginal people than non-Aboriginal people. And if you looked at the 2001 and 2009 patient health surveys, or they were formerly the inmate health survey, you would see a significant increase to that level of methamphetamine use. The other amphetamine use there is sort of, that's more like your Dexies, those sorts of amphetamines instead. So they're just classified differently within the survey. And heroin use is around 20% for this sample. So I guess you see there with the methadone uptake, which is good that people have been on methadone. I fully support methadone, but it also does have its limits, and it does treat opioid dependence, and so it has limited use for other drugs. Alcohol, other drugs, and offending. So you can see under the influence at time of offence, it's almost 70% of Aboriginal people reported that at the time of the offence for which they are currently serving a prison sentence, they were under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or both. And there's still a high proportion of non-Aboriginal people, which is over 50% there. What's interesting here, and this is of the people, so they asked whether people thought that your offending was directly related to alcohol or other drug use. And of that group, there's 24.1%, and of non-Aboriginal people, 19.3% of Aboriginal people, who answered that question. But there's a really for the non-Aboriginal people, pretty much all of their offences to support drug use has been for drug use, I should say, and that's over 90%. Aboriginal people, drugs is a big part, but also alcohol and drugs, and you can see a sort of a difference there as well. So we need to perhaps address alcohol as much as the other drugs, and the combination of both of those as well. So my work for the PhD, I went out to a prison called John Moroney, which is out in Windsor in Western Sydney. Used a grounded theory method and interviewed about 14 Aboriginal guys who I'll be speaking about shortly, but there were 31 men in total. I did do some follow-up interviews, but I'm not speaking about that data today. The participants, so just a bit of background about the guys. They're all from New South Wales. None of them identified as being Torres Strait Islander, which is one of the reasons why I sort of say Aboriginal, and as well as it being New South Wales where we're sitting. But so for some of these guys, it was their first term in prison for two of them, but most of them had been in more than one time previously. So they spoke about, I asked them about why do they use alcohol and drugs and what that does. And so there was this sense of health, feelings of emotional turmoil or financial difficulty and those sorts of stresses. And people also said that they needed to take drugs or alcohol in order to be able to function normally and just get by day to day. So in terms of withdrawal, 9 of the 14 had attempted AOD treatment in community but found it difficult to access services, but they could access such services while in custody. And so we have this situation, and I'm sure other researchers and other, not just researchers, people in public health have sort of said this, is that the prison system has ended up being pretty much like the default drug and alcohol treatment service in Australia. And so you end up going in there. So it's important that when people go into prison that they do get the right support. And Ray there, these are all pseudonyms, by the way, he was glad he went to prison. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. And he'd attempted to quit, as you can see, and this was what had occurred with the non-Aboriginal guys as well. But going into prison was kind of a circuit breaker, and they got sort of detox, and there was almost a sense of relief when some of the men spoke about going into prison. The Aboriginal guys were not stigmatised about being in prison. The non-Aboriginal guys, a lot of them were. So I asked a direct question, were you ashamed to be in prison? And the Aboriginal guys were like, one of them was a bit embarrassed but not ashamed. And I guess that may be, unfortunately, a sign of how well accepted prison is as part of normal life with an Aboriginal family, which you would hope it wouldn't be that. But so the stigmatisation just isn't there. So accommodation, well, none of the guys, when they'd been to prison, when they were released, they had accommodation difficulty and returned back to exactly the same situation from which their alcohol and drug use issues had arisen from. And so there's this real aftercare component, and I think most people in all people in the sector acknowledge that we do need to do much better with the aftercare, because you just send people out, they do the same things, we shouldn't be surprised really, and then they end up back in prison after a short time out. So just so going into prison and getting alcohol treatment, if you like, isn't a bad option if you're not stigmatised by that, and if you need that as a circuit breaker as well. So I asked them about the prison-based treatment, and so most of the guys had done some sort of form of previous treatment, and there are multiple answers to this. So there's a bit of a higher number than 14 there. So you've got the guys at the top have done departmental programs, and those included Getting Smart and Pathways program to address offending. 12-step programs and Alcoholics Anonymous were similar. There were 3 people who had attended those, and one of these guys hadn't been to any alcohol treatment or drug treatment, and still ended up in the most sort of extreme, that's probably the wrong word, but he's ended up in treatment in prison but not had anything before that, and so that's perhaps a little bit concerning that he's just sort of got to that point where he's arrived there. Access to programs when on remand. Now this is an area where it's very localised, is my understanding. And one of the guys had wanted to go to AA, but he and other things, but he couldn't do anything while he was on remand, and so he just didn't undertake any programs for a whole 18 months. It would be great to have some policy clarification on this particular issue, whether people on remand can or can't access treatment, particularly if they're there for quite a few years. So repeating programs, look, there's limited resources in prison, and so not everybody necessarily gets treatment, and the way it's done normally is that the people with the most severe alcohol and drug use issues are sort of put into the programs as a priority. But it's not necessarily, in a sense, you've got people who have more mild alcohol and drug use issues as well, and that perhaps they should be accessing those programs as well. So the thing of repeating programs was that sometimes you need to do them a couple of times, is what the guy said to me. And there was this sort of situation where they've got not enough places for too many inmates, and so not everybody can get that, so let alone actually repeating programs. Group dynamics, so supportive AOD treatment relationships. So the Aboriginal guys were really comfortable with each other, with the brothers, as the conversation went. And so when they were in a group with somebody who's not Koori, they weren't as comfortable in that situation. And what would happen is if you were in the program for a long time together, you could get to know them, and then that trust builds. But the Aboriginal fellows automatically kind of extended this trust to each other and arrived at a place where they could sort of speak more freely about their alcohol and drug use issues at that time. Incidentally, they also called me bro. Some of the Maori blokes called me bro as well, actually. And so there is this real connection that Aboriginal men have in prison. Humour in class, this was a very Aboriginal specific finding, and that was a bit of humour is great, and that you do need to have a laugh when you're doing the treatment programs because it engages you and gets people more motivated. And I think most people I know sort of know about the Aboriginal sense of humour, and you kind of have to laugh instead of crying sometimes, I guess. But it was incredibly important with this group. So I'm flying through this morning. So there is a rising prevalence of hazardous alcohol use and high prevalence of illicit drug use in prison. So we still need, this is a space that's, these issues have been there for a long time, and they will continue to be there for a while, I would imagine. And so we need to continue work within that area. I got to a point of saying co-facilitation of treatment, accommodation, psychologists and peer educators. And that was based upon what some of the guys had said about if you're straight from the university and you've never actually really been on drugs and those sorts of things, people were a bit dismissive. But if somebody had a bit of lived experience and had actually been through their AOD use issues and were in recovery, they had a bit more credibility with the guys. And so this sort of combination of the two seemed to be the best thing that could go forward, because they also appreciated the expert knowledge of the of the psychologist or the professional staff member. So Aboriginal or Koori only groups, in the first instance, it may be beneficial. I was speaking about that for a while a moment ago, and I think I've covered most of that. But if you've got a program that is short term, that would be possibly the way to go. But longer term programs do have benefits for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal guys mixed together. Some of the Koori fellows said it was the first time they'd ever, when they're in a group setting, the first time they'd ever realised that non-Aboriginal people had AOD issues as well, which was kind of a bit, I thought that was a bit interesting. So post-prison care, now spoke about that briefly a while ago, but I also undertook a systematic review as part of this work. And there were 25 papers identified for inclusion in that review, and looked at what treatment programs are most likely to reduce alcohol and drug use upon exit from prison, so when you're back in the community. That arrived at the same space as previous reviews, which was saying that prison-based therapeutic communities with aftercare are the best programs to support people post-release. So it just highlights that how critical that is. And one of the studies had quite a big, it was quite a big study, it had 4 cohorts. One was treatment only in prison, one was treatment in prison and after prison, one was a control group, and one was aftercare only, I think. But aftercare only. And what basically happened was the aftercare only group and the prison-based and aftercare group both did almost as well, and that kind of highlighted the need for the post-prison care as well. So look, that's me. So I'm happy to take some questions and we can have a bit of a chat if you like.
Awesome. So thanks so much for that, Michael. That was really great. So if you have any questions and you're not quite sure how to ask, there should be a purple tab on the right-hand side of your screen called the Collaborate panel. If you just click on that and then click on the chat icon and select everyone, you should be able to type a message in there. So please feel free to ask Michael some questions if you have any. While we're waiting, I actually had a question for you, Michael.
Yeah.
So I just, obviously, I guess there's a big issue with the amount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison. And I guess I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on things like drug courts, Indigenous sentencing courts. I wasn't sure if that was, part of your remit, but I was just curious to know.
It was less so directly part of the remit. I'm getting a bit of feedback myself now. But it is an interesting space, and drug courts were set up as exactly that, drug courts, and they sort of excluded alcohol-related issues.
Yeah.
That's changed quite a bit now, so there's alcohol-related issues in there, but I don't know what the full uptake is of the drug court, because you have to have a particular criteria in order to be able to meet the entry into drug court. And if you had at some stage had some kind of violent offence, which is possibly more related to alcohol or amphetamine use, so yes, but you were then excluded from being eligible to drug court. So right. The local sentencing for Aboriginal people, and I think that's been an initiative in Victoria. It's been very good, but the gains, my understanding, is that the gains are not quite as large as what they would like them to have been. Yeah. But there's certainly been some benefit.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Michael. So we do have a question here from Siobhan. So she says, thanks for the presentation. Are you aware of any research done into AOD issues for women in prison and for young people in youth detention?
Okay. There's a number of Aboriginal women, such as one of my supervisors, or both my supervisors, Megan Williams and Jill Guthrie, who have done some work in that space. But in terms of going in and interviewing people inside the prison, I'm not quite sure where that's at, and it's certainly something that I am mindful of. I think with the prisons, the research in that area, there seems to be some people, probably not enough, but some people doing post-release care, that kind of research, but not as many people going into the prison to do that. But we can certainly do with more work in that area. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of just how I see the sort of state of play at the moment with that.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So do we have any other questions? While we're waiting, I might just put up both of our contact details. Well, I'm not sure if anyone does have any questions, but if you do have any down the track that you'd like to get in touch with Michael, his contact details are on the slide there. And if you also have any questions about the Alcohol and Other Drugs Knowledge Centre, then you can feel free to contact me because my details are on the slide there as well. So we do have another webinar coming up soon, and stay tuned to hear more about that from us.
I just noticed that there is a question there, and that was the thanks for the presentation about the AOD, about minimum price of alcohol effect in the Northern Territory, and that is where you sort of increase the minimum amount on cask wine and that sort of stuff, so in order to reduce the use. I don't really know in terms of that having an effect on people entering the prison system. I really couldn't answer that, but it'd be an interesting thing to look at, really.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can wrap up now.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.